Okay. Sorry, as I wrap that up. Um, Things we want to talk about. And if I muted you or you need to say something, let me know. And feel free to type in the chat if you have a question or comment as well. Thing number one I wanted to talk about, extra credit. So let's look at that. Extra credit's due Friday. I noticed my typo in the extra credit, 2 of the 4 words. So sorry about that. My intention on the extra credit is probably that you would watch that video about Japanese internment and then make comments about it. You know, was it mostly what I want in your comments about it would be this part right here. Let me see if I can. Serna, there we go. Be sure to discuss the source of the propaganda. So who made it? Where did it come from? The intended audience, who would see it? Where would they see it? Remembering people didn't have TVs yet. Any part of the item that seems exaggerated or dishonest. As a rule, propaganda doesn't lie. It just tells one side of the story and usually an exaggerated side of the story. Because if it's an out and out lie, people just go like, that's a lie. But if there's an element of truth, they go like, maybe I can't argue that. You can just argue the extent of the truth. Yeah. And a lot of times too, what propaganda produces is a lie of omission. They leave out an important part of the story. You understand lies of omission because we've all done them. Typically when we're children and we're in trouble with our parents, but we do them as adults as well. I'm sure, I trust that we do. Where you leave out an important part of the story, like, you know, did you break this? Or, you know, were you studying last night? It's like, yes, I was studying last night, but, you know, I'm not going to say what I was studying last night. So leaving out important parts of the story. And whether you think the propaganda was effective. And that, you know, that's your opinion, of course. So, but if you have some evidence that suggests that it was, that would be good. Yeah. And if you're wondering about Japanese internment, you can read all kinds of stuff about it. And I'm sure, I feel like I already told you. Sorry, there were some fairly famous people later on, who were interred. I guess our most famous two were Mr. Sulu from Star Trek, George Takei, and then, God, what is the name of the other guy? He was Mr. Miyagi and Arthur on the Happy Days. I don't know why I can't, this is so terrible that I can't think of anything. But they're 2 actor kind of dudes that were in there. And they've both written pretty widely on the internet. There really were not a lot of people who protested and tried to get out of those camps. And there weren't a lot of attempts to, none that I'm aware of, people to break out. I mean, this was a fairly law-abiding community, and the protests that they took usually went through the courts. So that's how you ended up with Korematsu versus the US. And there were other cases as well. And there are lovely stories about, you know, neighbors who, when these folks got sent into internment camps, took over their property and kept it up until they got back and then just gave it back to them. Now, that is not typically what happened. Usually their neighbors who were business competitors just bought it from them and paid next to nothing. But there are, you know, some of those heartwarming stories, not too many, because I guess they wouldn't stand out if everybody was that nice, right? Okay, so extra credit. And let's see, the other thing that I wanted to mention to you, wrong button, sorry, was the timed question study guide stuff. Okay, so this is in course documents. And the first part of this really is just your reminder of what to study for the quiz that's going to pop up on next Wednesday. Oh, and I forgot to tell you, propaganda, please turn that in on time. Since it's extra, I really don't want to take that late. And if you're wondering when is on time, it's tomorrow. and it's tomorrow, end of the day, so 11:59 officially. I think the way it works that if you've started inputting it before 11:59, it will still accept it. So you have some sort of issue with that, let me know, but send me the email when you have the issue. That doesn't mean that I'm going to answer it at 12:02. My guess is I'm probably not, but at least I'll have a record of your email at 12:02. Now, don't be silly with me and everybody email me at 12:02. They're like, really? I was trying. But I wouldn't expect you to do that. But yeah, when I taught high school, I would expect more of it. So Unit 3 timed question, you've got the list here, but then in the additional resources section, one of the things I kind of wanted to point out in the, let's see, this one, chapter 24, optional videos. All right, most of these videos are really short, but the one that says this is long but really good, it's about the civil rights movement. By long, I mean 30 minutes, okay? So if you are interested in more information about the civil rights movement, but you really just want to see it and hear it, that's a pretty good source. It's from, crud, I forgot the name of it last class too. It's called A Time for Justice. I don't know why I can't think of the name of the group that puts it out, but it's a civil rights group that's pretty well known. But they do a lot of videos about civil rights. And what it does is it compiles a lot of clips from the time period and recreates some of the audio and adds back some of the original audio. So kind of interesting. It's pretty well done. If you've been to public high school in the United States, you probably have seen the video before because it's pretty widely distributed. Crud, I can't think of the name of it to save my life, but oh well. But the video is called A Time for Justice. When somebody just came into class and I didn't notice who it was, so oh, there we go. All right, I gotcha. All right, so I'm just adding to the roll. And I'll check again at the end. But I would look at that maybe if you have time. And I didn't really talk so much about Malcolm X, but there's a video of Malcolm X. He's doing a debate. And if you don't know anything about Malcolm X, that means you grew up in the South probably. When we talk civil rights movement, we do not talk about Malcolm X because that is a Northern guy. And that's just not how, things were done in the South. But that is one super smart dude. I know Martin Luther King Jr. is as well. Those two guys are both brilliant. But Malcolm X has got his own kind of brilliance. He's got his I didn't make it through high school brilliance. And it is fascinating. And I don't mean, oh, crud, who doesn't unplug their phone? I don't mean that he was street smart. He certainly was that as well. But this guy is a gifted intellectual. You'll be impressed by listening to him on that television show, perhaps, or reading some of his writing. So I'll go and play the phone here in a sec. We might even hear the message here. Let me find the next thing. No message. That's okay. A lot of times the message is for somebody who doesn't live here. God, maybe we're not having class because the minutes what do we call those? The notes are gone. Let me reopen those really quick. And then I can show them to you, hopefully. Close that. Darn. You would think as much as I've taught online, we'd be good, but no, not yet. All right, let me go turn off the phone, unplug it. Okay. Okay, that's where we were, I think. All right. So, 50s. We had talked about the end of the 50s politically with the Nixon-Kennedy thing, and that's kind of how we You've got civil rights kind of bookmarked in the middle of the Kennedy thing. It is really going to bug me that I can't remember the name of that organization that puts out those videos. So I'm going to look it up because it's going to drive me crazy. But when you're doing the weekly question, and the weekly question is to talk about why civil rights becomes a big deal during this time period. I mean, that's not exactly what the weekly question is, but it's kind of what the weekly question is. I'm sorry. You've got to talk about World War II. Maybe you start with, you could start with Plessy versus Ferguson. You could start with Plessy versus Ferguson, I think. And remember that Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, is the court case that causes segregation to spread throughout the country. So, I'm sorry. It really is bothering me that I can't remember the name of that company that does the civil rights. So I'm just going to have to look it up really quick. Otherwise, I'm going to be distracted for the whole class. I know that's dumb. Don't tell me. I know that it's dumb. I can't believe this is bothering me so much. Do you guys ever have issues like this? You're going like, no, we're not nearly as crazy as you. I believe you. I do. Poop. I promise you, I don't normally have this kind of weird problem, but today I'm just having it. So there you go. Teaching tolerance, that's what it's called. Okay. All right, now we can go on with class now that my breakdown has stopped. Goodness. All right. So the company that produces those videos, they have all kinds of really good online stuff as well. And if you're ever a teacher, some of that stuff's really useful. I would also suggest to you that the group that they're a part of, which I'm not going to be able to remember, they're funded by a political group as well. And the political group's a political group, but the teaching material is really pretty well done. All right. Yeah, thanks for. No, I would have remembered NAACP typically. Maybe not today though, Jalen. Maybe not. No. So, all right. Southern Poverty Law. Yeah, Southern Poverty Law Institute is the group. And that has some, political leanings, but the teaching tolerance stuff, a lot of that's really good. A lot of things. So even if you're, more conservative, I guess you would have guessed that group, that Southern Poverty Law Center, kind of leans more to the left than the right. But a lot of the teaching material, it's really just clips of old civil rights stuff, which it's the stuff. I know you can edit things and leave things out, but civil rights movement, there are very few people that can go back and go like, no, that really wasn't necessary. No, there really wasn't that much discrimination. Anybody who says that is not paying very close attention to the historical record, whether they're conservative or liberal. I know lots of people who are both, and extremely both. I'm kind of more in the middle, as you've probably guessed. I don't know anyone from either side either edge of conservative or liberal who would say the civil rights movement was probably overblown and unnecessary. There are people, just to alert you, there are people who would argue that Brown versus Board of Education is not a legitimate Supreme Court decision. And the same people would probably argue that Roe versus Wade is not a legitimate Supreme Court decision, but it's probably more about process than result. They think that that should have been done in the legislature rather than in the courts. And most people go like, yeah, it should have, only it wasn't going to be. And you really see that with the civil rights movement, which I will refocus on now that I can remember teaching tolerance. So I apologize about that. All right, back to business. So you start with Plessy in 1896. You're just kind of setting the stage for the Supreme Court case that says segregation is okay. That's the one with Homer Adolph Plessy, the dude in Louisiana who wants to ride in the whites-only train car so he doesn't get stuff all over him. And he wants to set a precedent that if you pay for the same thing, you get the same service. And the Supreme Court says, you know, if it's relatively similar, it's good enough. So separate but equal. They don't say relatively similar is good enough. The phrase is separate but equal. So Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, sets up the separate but equal standard. So then the NAACP and their legal wing and some other folks will start to redefine what equal is. So you'll start to see that happen. Other stuff that you may want to go back and put in. So you've got Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. You've got World War II. And I know I've said this a bunch of times, so you're probably going like, oh my gosh, is she going to talk about World War II again? Yes, because you've got hundreds of thousands of African Americans, primarily men, but some women as well, who serve in the war effort. They serve overseas. They serve in places where they don't segregate by race, or they do segregate by ethnicity in some of those places, but they don't segregate by race. So they live in an unsegregated environment off base, they experience it, and they also, it's, you know, the military training makes you a more confident person. You're in better shape. You're trained to be in charge, to solve problems, to be, you know, to be tough, I guess, at the very least. So you're used to being given a problem and you go in and solve it. So after you have helped defeat racism overseas, you know, Hitler and racism and lots of other stuff too, and then you come back to the homeland, probably in the deep South, and some guy who wasn't in the military and hasn't served his country the way you have says like, hey, and calls you a name, you can't use that water fountain. You're going like, I bet I can. And you're going to fix the system that allows that guy to tell you you can't use the water fountain. Here's some other things that happened because of World War II. Not only do you have the training and the background and the overseas experience and a newfound confidence, you also have the GI Bill, which says that you can get a home loan and you can have free college. However, if the college doesn't admit you because you're Black or Hispanic or Asian, then it's really hard to take advantage of the free college. And if the neighborhood is segregated that you want to move to, it's kind of hard to buy the new house, no matter how good your loan program is. So you'll see issues of segregation in housing and education that have to be solved. Now, Brown versus Board of Education, super important, top 10 court case. You got to know what it is. 1954, this desegregates public schools. Now, this is the end of a very long process that the NAACP started in the 1920s, led by a lawyer named Charles Hamilton Houston, who you could read a book about if you liked for the book review, and you would probably be pretty impressed. His most famous student is a fellow named Thurgood Marshall. You could read about him and you would also be pretty impressed. He's going to be the first African American on the Supreme Court. Houston was the fellow who graduated from Harvard Law School and then started a law school at Howard, traditionally, historically Black college in DC. And the whole purpose of the law school was to train lawyers so that they could reverse Plessy versus Ferguson. So that was his entire goal in starting the law school. And of course, the school continued after that and had other goals, and you could still go there and that sort of thing. However, they start in the 20s, and one of the first court cases that they start with litigation in the 20s, and they start having success right after World War II. And the success that they start to have is in desegregating law schools. Now, at first they do it in the North, but then they have to individually sue at different schools. One of the schools that they sue at is the University of Texas. And I don't know if you've ever been to the UT Law School. I'm not sure why you would have. I have for research purposes. And I was working on my master's thesis. And then I went down there, and they have all the displays from that court case, which is really fascinating stuff. So Heman Sweat, which is really kind of a rough name for a person, but Heman Sweat wanted to go to UT Law School. He was a military veteran, and wanted to be admitted there. And they understood at UT that they had to admit him, so they created a separate law school for him. And they called it the University of Texas Law School for Negroes, which would have been an appropriate term in that time period, clearly is not anymore. He was the only student, and they put him in the basement of a building with a very small law library. Of course, he sued, and he wins. And he wins because he's able to convince the judge, and he and the NAACP, so the people arguing the case, are able to convince the judge that law school is about more than going to the same school. It's about being in the same classes, with the same professors, with the same classmates, because the argument and the resources and the professors and the discussion really, really matter in law school. And so that was accepted, and there's no more segregated law schools. So then NAACP says, we got that one, so let's go to medical schools. So they did. They went to medical schools and schools of nursing, and then eventually all graduate schools. And then they got to colleges, and then, public schools. So Brown versus Board of Education is the public school version of that case. That happens in 1954. It's a combination of four different cases from throughout the country. Three kind of, I think one is deep south, two are kind of East Coast South, and then one is in Kansas. And they named the entire case Brown versus Board of Education after the Kansas case, because they wanted to make it not just about the South. They wanted to show that this was a problem throughout the entire country. And it was more of a problem in the Midwest and the South, but it was, you saw pockets of it everywhere. So Brown versus Board of Education is argued at the Supreme Court by Thurgood Marshall. When the court case starts in 1954, the Chief Justice is a fellow named Fred Vinson, V-I-N-S-O-N, not on a quiz or anything, just spelling it in case my accent keeps you from understanding it. And he had been Chief Justice for a long time, and he dies during the case, not at the court during the case, but during the era of the case. So they'd already had oral arguments, they'd had discussions. Vinson had told the others on the Supreme Court that he was leaning toward not overturning the case, and that had a lot of people kind of on his side. It looked like it would be 4-4 with one person undecided. So it was going to be a 5-4 decision no matter what happened. When Fred Vinson died, he was replaced by a fellow named Earl Warren, and you may have heard of him a little bit. He's going to preside over the Supreme Court for about 20 years, and in that time period, they're going to do lots of things that expand civil rights in a pretty unusual and dramatic way. Earl Warren, before he was on the Supreme Court, was the governor of California, and he had run the Eisenhower for President campaign in California. So he had not ever served on a Court. He was a lawyer, he had a legal background, but he had not served as a judge and certainly had not served on the Supreme Court. He was really getting the job as a reward for helping Eisenhower get elected to the presidency. Now, if you're wondering, was that common in that time period? Absolutely. To be honest, until the late 90s, with very few exceptions in between, pretty much if a president said, I want this guy on the Supreme Court, the Senate said, okay, and confirmed him pretty much unanimously, unless that person was criminal. You know, they found some criminal background. Otherwise, they really just rubber stamped all of the presidential appointments. So this, I want to know where you stand on issues. I want to know where you went to college. I want to know, you know, what you did, you know, when you were in law school. All of that stuff is really new. It really is. It started with Robert Bork, where people on the Judicial Committee in the Senate, Judiciary Committee in the Senate, decided that his views were too extremely conservative, so he was not put on the Supreme Court. That's really when it started. And then, of course, in the modern era, very few judicial nominees are just unanimously put forward. Now, that does happen from time to time, and well, that's maybe my statement's not completely accurate. The judges that Barack Obama appointed, they were put in very quickly and with very large majorities. I know some of you are going like, well, that's because he picked better people. Maybe, I don't know. I think it's because they were qualified, and when he made the appointments, it's in the middle of the term, so it wasn't terribly controversial. Now, we all know from the last couple of hearings that he did appoint a fellow named Merrick Garland that the Senate just said, nope, they wouldn't even bring him up for a hearing. And okay, we'll talk about that some other time. That's not the point of this at all. Okay, but Earl Warren gets appointed to the Supreme Court. The Congress or the Senate goes, not a criminal, let's put him in. Now, the guys on the Supreme Court, and in this instance, guys really were all men, they just went, oh my goodness, no, not a politician, not a guy who really doesn't understand the court. Why in the world do we have to deal with this again? So they really expected him to be kind of a dud and just a political hack. And it turns out he took his study of the law pretty seriously and, you know, was able to discuss legal things in a fairly intelligent way. I mean, they were impressed with his legal acumen, with what he knew. He also did not come in and say, like, I'm in charge now, you're going to do what I say. He came in and said, look, I'm the newest one at this, so, you know, I want the most senior justice to lead conferences. They did some rehearings of the case. And then when he did speak, after he listened to everyone else in the conference, he said, look, I don't think we can honestly continue with segregation unless we want to say that blacks and whites are inherently unequal. And there's no good reason to say that. You know, science doesn't back us up, morality doesn't back us up, political philosophy doesn't back us up. We can't say that. So we have to vote in favor of this, and we have to reverse Plessy. So they kind of looked at him like, okay. And he said, but I also understand that we can't do this without a legal reason to do this. So he made a committee of those guys headed by a fellow named Felix Frankfurter to lead the legal discussion, because Frankfurter was widely accepted as the most intellectual member of the court. So he was in charge of that. And what Earl Warren told them was, if this ruling is 5-4, we'll start a civil war. He didn't say it quite that way, but that's essentially what he was saying. He said, this has to be not close, and it would be even better if it were unanimous, which is what it turned out to be. And that Supreme Court, that group of folks who were very diverse in their opinions, and several of them really not so convinced that overturning Plessy versus Ferguson was a great idea because of the social unrest it would cause, and they were correct about that. by the end of that case, they all agreed that legally there was no way to sustain Plessy versus Ferguson, so they had to overturn it. So it's a really interesting process, which you clearly can read a lot about if you would like. Since I talked about it for that long and could talk about it for longer, I promise you that I could. I won't. But Brown versus Board of Education, very complex case, 1954, unanimously desegregates public school. And the South goes, okay, we'll no, you know they didn't. The South did not agree with that at all. Other stuff that happens right about the same time, and I didn't mention this as much in the other class, but something very bad happens to a young man named Emmett Till. And I can't remember if what I've linked this to is the video or the article. Let me see if I can tell. It's the article about the video. There's a PBS movie episode that lasts for an hour that's about this, and it would be incredibly depressing for you to watch. But what happens is Emmett Till fellow is a little kid, 14-ish. Well, he's a big kid. He's like 6 feet tall. But if you see pictures of him, he's got the little chubby cheeks and stuff. He's a baby-faced little kid, big kid. And he is going to school in Chicago. His mom is from Mississippi. His dad is overseas in the military. There's interesting controversy about his parents, but nothing related to the case, of course, just there. For the time period, a little scandalous because the dad, it doesn't matter. It doesn't make any difference to the case, but the dad maybe is not a good husband. We'll just go with that. And so the mom is really kind of a single mom. One of the things that shows up too in the trial is that Mrs. Till has a pretty good job in Chicago. And so when she comes to the South, she's better dressed, she speaks better. And that's kind of hard on a lot of the Southerners as well. So there's a lot of weird things in the mix here. But what isn't weird and isn't argued about is that Emmett Till is sent down to Mississippi to stay with his great uncle, Mose Wright. And his mom tells him, like, I'm going to send you down so you have something to do for the summer. You can hang out with your cousins and meet some of my family. But here's the thing. The South and the North are different. And you cannot behave in the South the way you behave up here. He went to a desegregated not middle school, but junior high for the time period, and was about to go to high school. He had black and white friends. He had a yearbook, which he took with him so people could see pictures of his black and white friends. In the South, he went down and argued, told him like, yeah, my girlfriend is white, which he probably didn't have a girlfriend. He's, probably just making up stuff because he's a 14-year-old boy and trying to show off. Well, his cousins and his mom told him, like, you don't talk to white people, you don't talk about white people, you don't look at white people, you especially don't talk to or look at white women because it could be the last thing you ever do. So this kid thought his mom had no idea what she was talking about because honestly, which of us did think our parents were intelligent when we were 14? It's like, no, my mom really has a pulse on society right now. So he just thought his mom was dumb because we all think our parents are dumb when we're 14. And he just went down and did his thing. And his cousin said, hey, you got a white girlfriend. We dare you to talk to the white lady in the store. Well, he did because, his cousins dared him. And he either said bye baby to her or whistled at her or something. That part is in dispute. What is not in dispute is that her husband and brother-in-law came to Mose Wright's house that evening with a gun, took him away, and he was never seen alive again. So they ended up torturing him and killing him, and it's really brutal stuff. They find him tied to a cotton gin fan that was thrown into a nearby river. And when they find him several days later, he's unrecognizable and had been tortured. The only way that they knew for sure it was him, because remember, it's too early for DNA and fingerprints are a little iffy during this time period, although they had them, but his would not have been easy to check because he'd been in the water for so long. But the only way that they completely recognized him was he'd had a ring with his initials, and that was still on his very swollen finger. So that's how they identified him. Well, they end up having a trial for the brother-in-law and husband, and it's an all-white jury. They have some Black journalists who come from the North, either from Black magazines or newspapers, or from the NAACP. The mom comes down, and they seat them in the back of the courtroom at a card table. So it's pretty weird stuff. And at the end of the trial, the jury's out for somewhere between 30 minutes to an hour, and they find him not guilty and come back and congratulate them and kind of hug them and handshake. They don't hug because it's the South and it's the 50s and it's all men. And then the two gentlemen, the murderers, sell their story to a magazine and make about a year's annual salary for the Deep South. They get a couple $1,000 for selling their story about how and why they killed Emmett Till. This is the year after Brown versus Board of Education. So it's a sign that even though the civil rights movement is moving forward, it's a very slow movement. It's not a highly accepted movement. That same year as Emmett Till is murdered in Mississippi, you've got Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., and bus desegregation in Montgomery, Alabama. And Rosa Parks, certainly not the first African American who is asked to move from the front to the back of the bus and refuses and gets arrested, but she's the person the NAACP chooses to make the court case about. The reason that they choose her is because she's a really good person. She's highly respected in the neighborhood. She's the secretary for the NAACP. She's an educated woman. She's also kind of a soft-spoken but very assertive kind of person. So people really respect her. She's not in your face, but she stands up for stuff, and people like her. And also, you can't say anything bad about her that's true. Other people who had been arrested, I mean, there was one lady that very summer, I can't remember her name, but she was a single mom with three kids who had not finished high school, and the NAACP went, no, you cannot be our poster child for this case because it's easy to criticize your personal life. So they had to pick someone whose personal life was above reproach. And I know some of you are going like, well, that's not fair. That's true. That is not fair. It's also the 1950s, and fair is not a really important principle in the 1950s. It's proper. Who is proper? Rosa Parks is proper. They also had to pick somebody to be the spokesperson for the movement who's male, because it's the 50s, and also proper. So proper would mean well-spoken, intelligent, maybe formally educated, and not with a criminal record. And I know you're thinking, why would that be a thing? Well, almost everybody in the South who had led a civil rights demonstration got arrested and then was a criminal. So in the headlines in Southern newspapers, it would say convicted felon or convicted criminal. It was rarely a felony, but convicted criminal so-and-so led this demonstration. So when you start off with that, it messes with your credibility. So they needed to find somebody who hadn't been very involved yet, but was going to be a very good spokesperson. They picked Martin Luther King Jr., in part because he's 25. He's like the baby Martin Luther King Jr. If you see pictures from this era, you'll look at him and go like, oh my gosh, he looks 12. He does look really young, but he's 25. He had just finished his doctorate in divinity. So he'd spent his whole adult life in college, and he was very studious. And it was too early for, to lead demonstrations. You didn't do that in the 40s because, World War II. And you didn't do it, when he was wrapping things up, although that's when it started. So And he's the preacher at a fairly important church in the area. So he's got a base of operations. He's got a place where they can meet. He's well respected. He really speaks well. And if you've heard any speeches he's given, you know that. He writes really well. He's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., so he's highly educated and no criminal record. So he's going to become the spokesperson. So they have an unassailable spokesperson and an unassailable plaintiff. And they're going to end up winning this case in court. Now it takes over a year, and the bus company in Montgomery refuses to desegregate, no matter how much pressure, public pressure, this movement puts on them. So they lead a bus boycott, in Montgomery, and the bus boycott lasts for over a year. The company is very close to bankruptcy, and they still won't desegregate. Also, I'll mention that the people who really organize this bus boycott are the women in the community, and they're primarily college professors at traditionally Black colleges. So they're Black female professors. And that's in part because they have access to copy machines. I mean, you got to make some copies. And those are the old days where you're cranking out the copies, you don't just press a button. So they stayed up all night organizing this stuff and distributing copies and making rideshare programs. And, without the technology that we have in the modern era, these guys performed some pretty important feats. They were quite impressive. And if you read more about the details of the civil rights movement, you'll notice that the face of the civil rights movement in the South is typically Black male preachers, educated men, and the footwork is usually Black educated women. So I think it's fascinating to look behind the scenes. But other things that you'll notice about Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., all of these organized movements, when you get to the lunch counter sit-ins, they all happen at certain times of day, usually in the middle of the day. They always call the media, so they make sure that reporters are there. And they always do it in the middle of the day because they want it on television for the evening news. So they have to have enough time to process the film, to put it all together, and then to put it on air, which takes much longer during that time period than it does now. It's also hugely important that the movement be nonviolent. And if you read much about what the leaders of the southern part of the civil rights movement thought, and honestly the northern, with the exception of Malcolm X during this time period, they knew that for the civil rights movement to be successful, that it had to be nonviolent so it would be acceptable to middle-class white people. So this movement for equality is not going to be successful if it's not acceptable to middle-class white people, because middle-class white people own the businesses in towns. They typically are the reporters, and they vote. They're the politicians as well. So Martin Luther King Jr. understood that they had to appeal to that demographic, so they had to adopt the policies and beliefs of that demographic. Now, to be fair, Martin Luther King Jr. is not a super violent guy that's going to go around punching people and looting and destroying property and that kind of stuff. And that's not a comment about anything that's going on currently. In this time period, none of that would have worked at all. I mean, because what would have happened is there would have been a news team there, and they would be filming the demonstration. And then if, say, African-American guy got harassed by the police, so he decided he'd pull a knife on the police or he would punch the police officer, the entire story would be supposedly nonviolent protester punches police officer, and no one would care what the other side of the story was. There would be no other side of the story, and it would 100% discredit the civil rights movement. So to the point where these folks had summer training in protesting. So they had like summer camp for protesters. It was led by a fellow named Bayard Rustin. And if I can find the chat, where are you? I will type that person's name in there because he might be a guy you want to read about, and then I'll tell you why. Oops, I'm not typing very well. I had that typo last. So this fellow, Bayard Rustin, kind of a Quakerish sort of fellow, African-American man, also openly gay. And that's the issue for him. You cannot be openly gay in the 50s, especially if you're a black dude, but honestly, anybody. You can't be openly gay in the 50s. It just is a no-go. We've already talked about it. It means you're communist, you're probably a spy, you got mental health issues. You can't be gay. And if you are, you work really hard to hide it, except Bayard Rustin and apparently his partner, like, nope, I'm gay. But he was the trainer and the organizer of a lot of the civil rights movements. So they had summer camps where he had groups of people who like yelled and screamed at the protesters and threw things at them and spat at them and that kind of stuff. So that the protesters would have practice hearing that stuff, being treated that way, and he would teach them, what to say, how to roll up into a little ball, into a defensive position so that they didn't get injured. So really important kind of training. He also organized the March on Washington, the really big civil rights demonstration in 1960, which culminates with the I Have a Dream speech. But he is always in the background of this movement. There's a really good PBS-ish video about him called Brother Outsider. And the next chapter of the book mentions him, I think, in passing, but he's really important to the movement. And the people who led that movement understood how important he was, but also understood that he could not be a public face of the movement because he was openly gay. He understood that as well. And to be honest, when I went to school, no one ever mentioned him. And when I did my undergraduate, no one mentioned him. And then when I started doing, more independent reading, when I started teaching, like, why has no one ever talked about this guy? And some of it is, there's a lot of stuff to talk about, and maybe he doesn't make the top 10 of the list of stuff. But I think in the modern era, we go like, that guy should probably be in the top 10 of stuff because of all the stuff he planned and all the people he trained. He really is foundational in some ways, not in the same way that like Brown versus Board of Education case is not legally foundational, but I mean, he's the trainer. He's really important in the movement. And also a reminder of what kind of civil rights movement would be acceptable in the 50s and what kind would not. So not just, you have to be straight to be a leader, but, also you have to be nonviolent and you have to be above reproach. So they had to pick the right people at the right time in the right places and portray them publicly in the right way to have any hope of success. So part of what I'm trying to point out to you here is this is a lot of work. The civil rights movement, it's not just like, let's get some folks organized and let's protest. It's like, get the right people at the right time with the right leadership and make sure that they have the right training, but make sure no one knows anything about the personal life of the trainers. And yeah, it's just a lot of work. It's a lot of work. And it's because it's the 50s. It has to be publicly acceptable. And everybody involved in the civil rights movement has to be above reproach, which is part of the reason that Dr. King is fairly acceptable in the 50s, and there is not a chance that Malcolm X is acceptable in the 50s. Now, if you compared those two guys, which you could, I mean, people do, what you would notice is if you looked at daily personal life, Malcolm X, that dude never did anything wrong once he became Muslim. I mean, that dude was devout. He didn't eat stuff he wasn't supposed to eat. He didn't ever drink alcohol, and he did not cheat on his wife. I mean, he was just an upstanding kind of dude. I'm not suggesting that Martin Luther King Jr. was a terrible dude. I am suggesting that we will find out a few things about him later on, that maybe he was a little more festive and that maybe I don't want to ruin Dr. King for you, but he may have had an affair. We know for sure he had an affair. I would tell my high school students when I would break that news to them that if his wife could forgive him, I think you should as well. I say this as a person who was married for 27 years, and my husband passed away. I didn't like get mad at him and tell him he had to go. But if he had had an affair, I would not have been as forgiving as Mrs. King was. However, however, my thought is, if she could forgive him, you've got to let it go. High school students, you guys, I'm not worried about it. The kids sometimes. All right, I know I've talked a lot about weird stuff, but it matters more than you think. I think it does. Okay. All right. Deep breath there. Let me stop for just a second to see if any of you have questions, and then I'll talk about Little Rock Central, and we'll wrap up with the Nixon Kennedy stuff. And I keep getting, I don't know if you can hear the noises. I keep getting messages because the person who took my car to fix it keeps texting me stuff or something. I don't know why it's showing up on the computer, but that's what the noise is. All right, do you guys have any questions that you want to ask before we go on to Little Rock Central? You guys, you're still with me, right? You didn't leave. You didn't go like, oh my gosh, she's going crazy about the civil rights movement. I'm really just trying to point out how it's so much different. Yeah, no, thanks for saying you're here. I appreciate it. But, you know, you had to be perfect to have a chance, almost perfect, to have a chance to be a civil rights leader. And, you know, I mentioned that Dr. King had an affair, which he did in the 60s. He doesn't have it in the 50s, he has it in the 60s. The way that his wife finds out is because the FBI is following her husband, and they take pictures and send the pictures to her. Oh my gosh, my goodness, what a time. So rather than protecting civil rights leaders, we sent the FBI to follow them and try to discredit them. And we're still doing that in the 60s. I know some of you are going like, that still happens now. It probably does. But I don't know. I mean, who knows what the government's doing? FBI, CIA, all that stuff. So, all right. Taking a drink and then we're back to stuff. Coke Zero for the record. It's usually Coke Zero or water. I need to switch off to water. All right, Little Rock Central. All right. So just little review of dates, just so we're all on the same page here. Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. World War II, which I assume you know we're involved in from 41 to 45, but you can just put it in the 40s. That's good. I know it starts earlier in Europe. So World War II, early 40s. Truman desegregating the military. Did I mention that? 1948 by executive order. Also, to secure these rights report that suggests that it's time to desegregate everything. I think that's the same year. You've got Brown versus Board of Education in 54. In 55, you've got Emmett Till and Rosa Parks. And then in 57, you have Little Rock Central. Now, I always assume that everybody knows about Little Rock Central, but then I assume everyone's the same age as I am, which I clearly know you are not. I can see some of your photos. It's like, yeah, those people are young, and you are old. Little Rock Central is a very large high school in Little Rock, as you might imagine, Arkansas. And the NAACP was frustrated at this point because it's 57. It's 3 years after Brown versus Board of Education. And the southern states are not working on desegregation. Even though the Supreme Court had said that segregation is inherently unequal, they had also said that segregation needed to be ended with all deliberate speed. And deliberate means take your time. So the South went, okay, we are going to take our time. So the South wasn't desegregated, which is why you've got to send in troops to desegregate Ole Miss with James Meredith, and you've got to desegregate the University of Alabama with troops. You saw that in Forrest Gump, which is not a true story. I hate to disappoint you. But public schools aren't doing it either. So the NAACP in Arkansas says, hey, we got to work on this. So they find 9 kids in Little Rock who say, like, yep, we'll do it. We will volunteer to go to Little Rock Central High School. So they enroll them. No way that they can say no. I mean, they've got the right to do it. So what happens is the governor of Arkansas, I can think of his name, but not the state. It's right there on the screen. The governor of Arkansas, Orval Faubus, says, you know what? We got states' rights. The federal government can't tell us what to do. So I'm going to send in the Arkansas National Guard, and we are going to make sure those Black kids do not come to our schools. So there's all this demonstrations, all kinds of craziness. The NAACP picks up 8 of the 9 kids to drop them off at school. One of them kind of is late and gets separated, and they are met with the Arkansas National Guard, who runs them off at bayonet point. The other girl who gets lost and separated from the group, and she gets surrounded by crowds of people screaming, lynch her, and she's in some trouble. And what ends up happening to her, which I think is one of the probably only the really good thing that happens on that day, is some old gal just, she just happened to be riding the city bus around that day, and her stop is near the school. She gets off and sees this, and she goes, no, not on my watch. I'm a grandma, and you don't mess with kids. So she went over and yelled at all those people that were harassing this African-American girl, and takes her on the city bus and rides home with her to make sure she's safe, which I think is pretty cool. And if you're wondering, it's an old white grandma, but grandmas are grandmas, and they don't like to see kids messed with. So good job, grandma. It's about the only good thing that happened that day. So Eisenhower, who's the president, goes, oh my goodness, it's probably not what he said, but what am I going to do about this? Because Eisenhower was not in favor of desegregation. He's really upset by this court case. He later on will say that his biggest mistake as president was appointing Earl Warren to the Supreme Court. He's not a fan of desegregation, and somebody he put on the Supreme Court is ordering it in public school. But he is a fan of following the law because, he's a military guy, and you have orders and you're supposed to follow them. So, and he is now in charge of executing the orders. I mean, he's the lead law enforcement officer in the country. I don't mean like he's the big police officer, but it's his job to make sure people follow the law. So he sends the 101st Airborne to Little Rock, and they guard the school. He sends 1,000, I think it's over 1,000 paratroopers, and then each of the 9 kids gets their own paratrooper who goes to school with them for the first semester. So, yeah, Little Rock Central's desegregated because Orval Faubus said, no, you don't. And then Eisenhower said, yes, we do. Now, that second semester, they take the paratroopers away, the individual ones. They kept the big group of them there for a couple of weeks. And then as they settled in, everybody had their own paratrooper. And then second semester, they didn't have their paratrooper. And people harassed those kids pretty harshly. One of them to the point where she retaliated, so they kicked her out of school. 8 of them finished the year. The one fellow, Ernest Green, and you could read books about him as well, does graduate from that class in it's either 56 or 57. But then what the government in Arkansas decides is, we clearly can't be in your face against the federal government because they didn't like that. We saw that. But there are other things we can do behind the scenes to promote segregation that they'll leave us alone about. And they were correct. So they decided that instead of just saying, no, we will not desegregate the schools, they just closed them. They closed the public high schools. They just closed them. and they gave everybody a voucher and said, you know what, here's your money, use it for whatever school you want. So since they closed the public schools, the vouchers were for private schools, and private schools could segregate. So they essentially resegregated their schools in the state of Arkansas by using private school vouchers with public money. That's also why some of you pay attention to public school debates. That's also why people get frustrated with older people, older civil rights kind of people get frustrated when they hear people saying like, no, I think we should use vouchers, because they remember, you know, the times in the South where the only reason you used vouchers was to segregate in public schools. So it's a rough time period. The federal government is really not very committed to enforcing desegregation unless it's in your face, like, you know, Orville Faubus did in Little Rock. But if it's quietly behind the scenes, they're okay with it and let it go for quite a while. The first president you see really kind of enforce civil rights stuff on a federal level is LBJ. So it's 10 years later, or 10 years after, after Brown versus Board of Education. Let's see, what else was I going to tell you about this? All deliberate speed. Oh, I know what else I was going to tell you. I know when I taught high school, and one of you could probably verify this, like end of the school year, we're done with the STAR test, like let's watch a movie. So one of the movies that I would be willing to show and kids were willing to watch was the movie about football and desegregation. Remember the Titans, which clearly I don't remember. Remember the Titans. And this is based on a true story. The coach is, what's his name? Denzel Washington. And it's about desegregating a football story. And it has really good movie or music. Yeah, you guys remember. Yeah, it is a good movie. And if you haven't seen it, it's probably worth watching. There's a lot of historical accuracy in it. The whole story isn't accurate, but the setting is. They are desegregating a public high school. Oh, fifth grade. Wow, that's a lot for fifth grade. They are desegregating a public high school in the 1970-71 school year. That's a sign that the South really took seriously the all deliberate speed. And this is in Virginia, which is really close to Washington, D.C., where all this stuff is going on very publicly. Now, I'm old enough that I was going to school during this time period. I was not in high school. I was in elementary school in the early 70s, and we still had segregated schools. And busing was a thing where they started busing kids from one neighborhood to another to try to resegregate schools that people were intentionally desegregating. And people protested that, and there was violence. So desegregation, even though the courts say it has to happen in 54, and occasionally the federal government in the late 60s is trying to enforce it, and there's civil rights movements and demonstrations and all kinds of stuff, there's still a lot of resistance to it. And it doesn't completely happen during that era. And I could make a really good case, and I'm sure some of you could too, that it still hasn't happened in a lot of ways. Although I get, I mean, because, you know, I taught in public schools, I get that the segregation is much more socioeconomic. I know I would always tell my students that they clearly didn't want me in their neighborhood because of that sign at the beginning of their subdivision that says prices begin at $400,000. That's a sign you don't want a public school teacher living there because we don't make that much money. but that is, I mean, that's the new form of segregation. And the Supreme Court has tried to deal with that as well. That's why you start to see public housing developments, Section 8 housing that's partly publicly funded in fancier neighborhoods. I mean, they've started to build those in Westlake. They've started to build those on the wealthier end of the school district I taught in near Vandergrift, which I'm sure makes those folks incredibly happy. But what the Supreme Court has noticed, and what other people who are honest will notice, is schools in wealthier neighborhoods tend to have better outcomes as far as test scores and kids going to college and that sort of thing. So if you're putting public housing only in poor neighborhoods, you're also making sure that those kids don't go to schools that might better prepare them for college. So oh gosh, what a complicated problem, isn't it? All right, so back to Kennedy and Nixon. We'll wrap this up really quickly because I know I've talked about this already. So 1960, Kennedy-Nixon election. It's really, the big concern is foreign policy. Who's going to do a better job with that? Nixon looks tougher on the surface. He's got that anti-communist House Un-American Activities background. He's also served as Eisenhower's vice president. Kennedy is a war hero and speaks really well. Nixon also, a skilled attorney, so he's good at argument as well. Probably, maybe the deciding factor in this was the televised debate, which we've already talked about, where Nixon looks and seems unhealthy, maybe dishonest. Kennedy looks more healthy. Nixon had that staph infection and wouldn't wear the makeup. They're about the same age, but Kennedy looks dramatically younger and healthier, which neither, he is younger, he's not healthier. We're concerned about Kennedy because he's Catholic, so it kind of goes on the I'm not very Catholic speaking tour. And he also picks a vice president who's very different than him. He picks LBJ, and we'll talk about LBJ quite a bit more in the very near future. We're talking next week, but Kennedy picks LBJ to attract the voters he won't attract. Kennedy's liabilities are that he's a city guy from the Northeast who went to Harvard, which some people admire, but some people resent. LBJ is going to be one of the people that resents that. Kennedy is as well, or excuse me, Nixon is as well. Nixon's going to point out his middle class, rise up from not really poverty, but certainly the lower part of the middle class to, his prominent position in politics. And this will be the closest election in US history to that point. At the end, I think it's 0.5 percentage point. It's definitely less than 1% that separates them in popular vote. And it kind of comes down to Illinois, where there are some irregularities, and Illinois goes for Kennedy. The Nixon campaign group does contemplate filing lawsuits and appeals to the voting count and to the irregular voting. A lot of dead people voted, almost all of whom apparently liked Democrats. But Nixon decided it was better for the country not to put them through that. And then he gives his concession speech and says he's going away and you won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore. Well, we will later on, and we'll kick him around just a bit. All right, so we've got Kennedy who gets elected. We like Kennedy too, because he's nice looking, but he also has a super cute wife and 2 little kids, and it just feels like a fresh start. We got young people with kids in the White House. It's kind of refreshing. Maybe we can let go of war stuff and desegregation stuff and fighting and sending the troops to Arkansas, and maybe we'll have something peaceful go on. So we're kind of in a good mood as the Kennedy administration starts, and then that will change pretty quickly. So, all right, I feel like I'm done, but don't run off just yet because I want to see if you have any questions, and I want to double check the roll really quickly. So before I stop recording, we'll see if you have questions. Do you have any questions? Anything you want to ask? So you can say it or type it, whatever makes you happy. All right, I will see if I can remember how to stop recording.